Okay, so we have our magazine in pieces. It's a bit of a mess. We need to put the whole thing back together again. How are we going to do this? We're going to start with the mechanical assembly. So we're going to mount the main part of the magazine back onto the frame and start securing the components around it. After that, we're going to tackle the wiring. So let's start with the main part. We have our base unit, and we're going to need to mount this section back on top. To do that, I need to pull the magazine forwards, place it on top. We're going to want to put these nuts back in. The issue is that we have to try and get the nuts down inside. It can be a little bit tricky to do this. So a good tip for what we're doing here, we're going to start with the one that's furthest most inside. So I'm going to take this bolt all the way to this end. Then we're going to gently lower this into position. We're then going to take our 4mm Allen key, insert it down inside so that the bolt is captured, and then with my hand I'm just going to screw that on underneath until it's finger tight. I think I've forgotten to put the washer on, so I'm just going to take that off. Go first with the washer and then with the nut. You really need 3 hands to do this, but I've only got 2, so we'll make do. So, washer on first, and then nut. Perfect. So, now this is in place, and what I've done is I've deliberately left a big gap here at the back, which will allow me to put the second one on slightly easier. So, I'm going to take that and see if I can feed it inside and drop it down the hole. Then I should be able to get the nut and washer on underneath. Perfect. So now that's done, I can begin to loosen it again slightly, position it where it should be. So you want it to be about 1 centimetre from the back, so there should be about a 1 centimetre gap here. So with that in place, I can then begin to tighten it. Of course, I can use my socket set in order to capture the nut on the bottom, and that will aid me in tightening this in place. So we can do that, and that's one tightened, and that should be coming into the second one being tightened. So now our magazine is fully assembled. We need to start working on the other components. So luckily I put these screws back in the sheet metal, so it should be easy enough to work out where stuff goes. We're going to start with the valve block. I'm going to take off these bolts, and we're going to mount the component. So we're going to want to mount the component so that these 2 ports are on the back, because obviously we need the pipes to come over to the cylinder. So we're going to start with the top one. We'll place it in the right place and just hand tighten it for now. I always find it easier to hand tighten first and then to tighten with the tools later. So second one goes in, and now that it's nicely aligned, I can use my 2.5 driver to screw it in. There we go, so that's on. Now let's work with our optical cable. Again, we're going to want to position the optical one like this. We've got the bolts already in there, and I'm just going to use my finger to make sure that they don't escape. So I'm going to remove both of these bolts and then start to reassemble them. And when I do this, I'm going to make sure that the optic is pointing towards the back. And also one thing just to be really careful of here, you have a small screw here which is going to be used to retain the ends of these fibre optics. We want to make sure that that screw is facing out. Obviously it's possible that you assemble this upside down and then you would have the screws facing in, and then you won't be able to tighten these. So you want to make sure that's pointing out as you get to this point. We could put the optics in now as well, but for now I'll just leave it. I'm going to take my 3mm and just tighten those up as well. There you go. Okay, next thing to work on is the mini I/O. So I'm going to lie the unit down, remove the bolts and washers that are used to hold it in place, position the unit on top, and I can then begin the process of bolting it back in. Now, when I removed this one was slightly stiff, so hopefully it will go in without too much issue. Yep, what's going on there? It's a little bit tight, so I'm just going to be a bit careful as I put that in. There we go. And now it's time for the next one. So again, just taking my 2.5mm driver and screwing it into position. You can always use your fingers to support the bolt as it goes through, just to make sure it lines up okay. Obviously this is slightly easier when you're not trying to block the camera view at the same time. There we go. Great, so we now have most of this mechanically assembled. We still have some wiring to do though, so let's talk about the wiring. We'll start first with the electrical wiring, and then we'll do the plumbing at the end because it's easiest just to throw in at the last bit. So how do we know how to wire this? We're going to have to look at the data sheet, because if we just start putting all the wires in the wrong order, we're not going to know where they go. If we look on the FESTO info portal, we can find that there is an MPS range. If we open up the MPS range, we can see there is here a category for hardware, and you'll see that things are split by systems, stations, or modules. Now, we're working here on just an MPS module, so we're going to open up the modules and click on the Stack Magazine option once the page is fully loaded. So here's our Stack Magazine. What we're going to do is go to Documentation, and we're going to take a look at the circuit diagrams. So the circuit diagrams here allow us to see where everything should be wired. It gives us an overview of the mini I/O, and then shows us also what inputs and what outputs should be connected to the different ports on this mini I/O. We can see here that we have our 3 sensors, and we can see the ports on the mini I/O that they are wired to. And then we can see here that we have one output, which is the slide advance solenoid, and we can also see the output that this one is wired to. So the important thing here is really the order in which they're wired, and making sure that we get this in the right order, because of course if we get it in the right order, then everything will work, and if we get it in the wrong order, then it won't behave as expected. Sometimes you're also able to look at the technical data, and what we have here is an allocation table where it shows us the information we need without having to look at the data sheet. Obviously, looking at data sheet is a really important skill that we need to learn, but also it's very useful to be able to look at this allocation table because it just shows us in plain English where things need to be wired. So we'll leave this on the screen as we begin our wiring process. We can see that we have slide retracted, slide advanced, and then magazine empty. These are our 3 sensors and the order in which they're wired. So we have input 0, input 1, input 2 for those 3 inputs. So we'll start with the slide retracted sensor. So if I take a little look here, I can see that that's this sensor on the back of the cylinder. That's going to be our slide retracted. I'm going to take this cable and I'm going to run it around the outside and then wire it into the mini I/O. It's also possible to feed this through the gap in the back. Whether or not you feed it through the gap or run it around the outside is kind of a personal choice. For me, making this slightly easier for us to view what we're doing, I'm going to run it around the outside. But if they come stock from the factory, you may find that they're wired through the inside. So we're going to take this retracted cable and wire it down. Now, the cable itself has 3 wires. You can see that it's got a black wire, that's our signal. We have a blue wire, that's our ground, and we have a brown wire, that's our 24 volts. And so what we're going to do is just make sure that we twist the end of these wires to make sure that they're nice and straight. Because obviously as you've pulled them out and been moving them around, it's possible that they have frayed a little bit. And if they're frayed, they're not going to go in very well. Now I have 3 wires, and I'm going to start with my ground, and then my power, and then finally work my way over to the digital input. Looking at the mini I/O, the first 4 contacts are our inputs. There's then 2 white contacts. These are analog inputs, but we're not using them. And we then have 4 output contacts. These are the grey ones, the next ones. So we're going to be using the inputs and outputs that are digital, but not the analog inputs and not the analog outputs. So first one, we're going to take the ground wire and wire it straight in to the bottom terminal. All I'm doing here is I'm pushing down on the spring lever and then firmly sliding the wire straight in and then removing the pressure on the spring terminal. What this means is that the wire will then be held securely in place. I'll do it one more time with the black one. So pushing the spring lever down, inserting the wire, letting go. And now you see that that wire is perfectly in place and it's not going anywhere. You should find that these wires are already cut to the right length. But of course, if as part of your training you've cut these wires shorter, you'll need to strip these wires back again. It makes it easier and neater if the blue is the shortest, the brown is the second shortest, and the black is the longest, because then you can run in a really nice pattern like this. Okay, so now we need to wire our next input. We're going to be using the slide advanced sensor. We can see that just here is the slide advanced sensor. So bringing it around the front, and again, just dealing with these wires because they've got a bit frayed since we pulled them out. So we have our ground, we have our power, and we have our signal wire. And again, we're going to start the insertion process. So pushing down on the spring lever and inserting the blue one. Okay, so as I've done that, I've managed to get my fingers fumbled and I've frayed the wire. If the wire is frayed, go back to the beginning, twist it, make sure that it's not being frayed, and do it again, because there's no point trying to put in a wire if it's frayed. You'll be there forever. So push down the terminal, insert nicely, and there we go, problem sorted. We'll do the same with the brown one. This is our power, and in we go, and the black one, and in we go. So as you're putting in these wires, you shouldn't be able to see any copper. If you can see copper coming out of these little terminals, then you need to rethink. So the next one is the magazine empty. This is the one from the optical cable. We haven't actually wired the optics in yet, but we're just worrying about the electrical wiring for now. So I'm going to take this M8 connector. It's a 4-pin M8 connector, and insert it onto the sensor. And then I'll begin the process of putting these in. So once again, for the close-up, I'm going to push down this spring lever terminal. I'm going to insert the wire and then let go, and it should stay firmly in place. We'll do the same with our power. So insert, and it stays in place. And the same with our signal. Insert, and it stays in place. You'll notice that the optical sensor has one additional wire. This is a white one. We're not going to be using this. This can be the negative edge of this signal. So the black wire gives us the signal when it's true, and this gives us a signal when it's false, but we're not using it in this situation, so we're just going to leave it here. We can cable tie it back later for neatness, or you could chop it off, but it's better practice to wire it back, just in case you might want to use that signal in the future. So that's our 3 input wires completely done. So we have our slide retracted, slide advanced, and magazine empty wired. We have one more input to wire, which is this slide advanced. Okay, so that's going to be this cable here, which is our solenoid cable. Again, I'm just going to sort out the ends of these wires and make sure they're not frayed. I'm going to clip the wire back into the front of the solenoid, lay this down again, and then begin the process of wiring. So we have, because this is a solenoid cable, it doesn't actually matter which way round the contacts go. There's a black one and a red one, and of course we could reverse it. It's unimportant. But just for consistency's sake, we can see here that we have a short black wire and we have a long red wire. So we're going to put the short black wire into our ground. We could use any ground, actually, on this system, but I'm going to use the one directly below the output that I'm wanting to wire. I'm going to insert the black wire first into our ground. There we go. And feed this through and wire this into pin 7, the first output pin. Perfect. Done. We're going to move on to make sure that we have our optical cables in the correct place. So I have the 2 optics here. One is a sender and one is a receiver, but it actually doesn't really matter which one is which. As long as they're both pointing at each other, then essentially they're the same. All we're going to do is make sure that we feed them through from the correct orientation. And there's a little gap in the aluminium profile here. So we can just feed it through there and get these in place. So I'll do one at a time just to make my life a little bit easier. So the bottom one goes in, and then the second one goes in, and then I can feed them together like that. Once these are in, all I'm going to want to do is take my screwdriver again and tighten up the little screw here that holds the optical cables in place. So we now have our electrics done, we have our opticals done, we have only one thing left to do, which is our pneumatic pipe work. So laying the magazine down, we have 2 pipes. Of course, we could cut new pipe if we wanted to here, but I will reuse the old pipe. And we have the 2 outputs here. Because we want the cylinder to be retracted by default, we're going to need to take a little look at the output here, and we can see that according to the valve instructions, it's printed here, we can see that the default state of this valve will be that the air will come out of 2. So therefore, we're going to want to take our pipe from 2 and take it into the front. And then obviously when the solenoid activates, it will fire over. And so we will take our second pipe and wire it into the back. And so that should be our pipe work completed. Now, at this point, we could begin to tidy the magazine up, but we're not 100% sure that we've done this right. I'm pretty confident, but how could we test? Well, we could test by using a sim box. The first thing I'm going to need is an air supply, so I have a manifold just mounted here, and I'm going to take air from my regulator and pass it through into the back of the valve. There we go. Now, if I turn on the air supply, hopefully the magazine should stay where it is. Perfect. That means that the pneumatics is correct because the default position is to have it in the retracted state. The next thing to do is to think about the electrical. How do we test this? Well, in a full MPS station, we could just install it. But I have here the C terminal that we normally have mounted on our MPS station. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a small double-ended mini I/O cable and connect it to the first terminal, X1, on the C connector. Just going to clamp that in there. And then I'm going to wire the second end into the mini I/O terminal that I have up here. Okay, so I'm going to just clamp this in place loosely and connect a sim box. So all I need to do is connect my sim box into the C connector, and I can now begin to evaluate what we're doing. So we just want to see what we're doing here. Let's see if we can rearrange this camera so that we can see the inputs as well. It might not be possible, but hopefully we can see it on the wide shot. So we have here the first 4 inputs that we're using and the first 4 outputs. I can already see that I've got a couple of inputs on here, so let's just see which ones they are. According to my datasheet, the slide retracted sensor is the first one, and it's on at the moment. That's good news because the slide is retracted. The third one down, so bit number 2, this is our magazine empty. That's on, and the magazine is currently empty. If I was to take something and break that internal sensor, we should see that the light goes off. So that's working as expected. The next thing that we can see is the slide advanced. Now, we could try manually moving this forwards, and hopefully as we move it forwards, the slide retracted sensor comes off, and there we go. The slide, bring it the whole way forwards, slide advanced sensor comes on. So we have both the retracted and extended positions working. And then finally, we need to test the output. So to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the strobe. This enables the outputs, and then I'm going to fire bit 0, because that's what's connected to my slide advanced. When I do this, we don't have any air on at the moment, but I should see that the solenoid clicks. There we go. We can see the light on the solenoid, so we know that's working. And we will test by pushing the first output. So air on, and push the first output. And the cylinder extends. Turn the first output off, and the cylinder retracts. So our magazine is successfully reassembled. Now all that's left to do is to make sure that everything looks good. So we'll disconnect the Simbox connector, we will turn off our air supply, and we will just introduce a few cable ties. So my preference here would be to make sure that we have at least one cable tie on the optical cables. We also have some on the pneumatic cables here. I like to try and keep these separate if possible. So we're just going to put one loosely around the optical cables to hold them in place. And then I'll snip the end off flush with my snips. I'll place a second one onto the pneumatic lines. And keep that in place. And I'll place a third one down here onto my electrical cables. If you're building these to a WorldSkills standard for competition, you need more cable ties, and more information about that can be found in the WorldSkills documentation. But for the purpose of doing this in a classroom, we just want to make sure that everything is neat and tidy and is safe to go back onto the MPS station. So, with our testing done, we're going to make sure our air supply is off. I'm going to disconnect the optical cable, and my magazine is now ready to be reinstalled.